On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie flew to Dallas aboard this very plane, Air Force One, SAM 26000. Earlier this week, in February of 2025, Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent assigned to protect Jackie Kennedy that day, passed away, age 93.
Here at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, I've toured this aircraft before and I've talked about the events of that tragic day. But today I want to revisit it and tell Clint Hill's story, what he did, what he saw, and the role that he was playing in those critical moments, including those inside this airplane. And inside this plane, we're going to see the places where the history unfolded. We're going to see where President Kennedy sat on the way to Dallas, the area where Clint Hill would have been, space where Kennedy's casket was placed for that flight back to Washington, with Jackie and Hill beside the casket the entire way. So we're going to climb aboard, and we're going to travel back to 1963.
In 1963, Clint was only 31 years old. He'd been with the Secret Service for about 5 years and had been assigned as Jackie's personal bodyguard since JFK had won the election. At first, he wasn't really thrilled about that assignment. He'd hoped to be on the president's detail, so protecting the president's wife felt more like a step down, kind of a demotion. But over time, that changed. He developed a deep respect and admiration for her, and he accompanied her everywhere: official visits, vacations, public events, horseback riding trips, family getaways, and even after the assassination, he stayed by her side, remaining on the detail until she moved to New York in '64. I have another video on my channel that goes into the detail about everything that happened that day on this plane. If you're interested in those specifics, I'll put that in the description. But for now, I just want to kind of give you a quick overview of the layout of this airplane so you better understand Clint Hill's experience on board. This plane was only about a year old at the time of the assassination, and it remained in service until 1998. It carried every president from John F. Kennedy through Bill Clinton. Up here in the front of the plane, you have the crew quarters, the communication shack here, and then over on this left side is a galley. Moving back in the plane, this area later became the president's suite. So this is the area where the president would have sat in later years. But in 1963, this was general seating for staff and press, and it was complete with electric typewriters mounted on the walls. Back here was the president's office in 1963. And this table here to my right is roughly where Kennedy's desk was. And these were the windows that he would have been looking out. On the flight into Dallas, this is where he would have been sitting. And to my left is where President Johnson was sworn in later in the day. So standing right here in this spot is where Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in to be president later that afternoon of the assassination. And we see here this image, famous image. This is where this picture was taken. He was facing this direction, and Jackie was to his left, Lady Bird Johnson to his right. This is where it happened. So traveling back through the plane here, this was all presidential office space. And then the aisle turned. Right here, it would have gone off to the right. And this would have been the president's bedroom. So there were two twin beds in this spot. The bathroom where Jackie Kennedy would have cleaned the blood off of her face. She famously didn't change her clothes, but off of her face would have been in a bathroom that was right about here where these chairs are. And then we continue back through here, and this would have been an area for the Secret Service to sit. And right here, where this gray chair is, these two rows of seats, these chairs back here, are the ones where the casket would be placed. They took these chairs out, and we'll talk about this more in a moment. They took these chairs out, and they placed the casket right down here and tied it down with cargo straps. And this is the area of the plane that Clint would have been sitting in on the flight into Dallas. So this is the door that they exited that day. Mrs. Kennedy stepping out first, followed shortly by President Kennedy. Clint Hill would have followed close behind, likely just a few steps after them, descending the stairs and taking a position nearby.
Governor Conley standing in the car with a big 10-gallon hat on. Mrs. Kennedy stepping in the car first. Now the president. They both in the back seat now. Now the motorcade will very shortly start to move out. Presidential car moving out. The President and First Lady. Big, beautiful Lincoln. Followed by Secret Service men, the car behind. Then comes the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson, Senator Yarborough. Dallas police out here in force today, doing a beautiful job of handling the crowd, along with a contingent of Texas Rangers.
Some of the most iconic images of Clint Hill that day actually involve the presidential limousine. He is the agent we see in the Zapruder film running toward the back of the car as Jackie Kennedy climbs onto the trunk. Clint recalled that he was standing on that left front running board of that follow-up car when he heard a sharp noise, and at first he didn't recognize it as a gunshot, maybe a firecracker, he thought. But then he looked at the president and he saw him slump forward, clearly in distress. Immediately, Hill jumped off that running board and sprinted toward the limousine. And as he ran, there was a second shot, and just as he reached the back of the car, the third and fatal shot hit.
And as I approached the car, just as I was getting there, there was another shot that was fired. That one I heard and I felt, and that shot hit him in the back of the head, and then it erupted out of the upper right quadrant, just above the ear. And out of that wound gushed blood and bone fragments and brain matter all over the back of the car, all over me, all over Mrs. Kennedy. When I started to get up in the car, Mrs. Kennedy came up in the trunk. She was trying to grab some of that material that had erupted out of the president's head, and she managed to get some of it in her hand. I grabbed her and put her in the back seat. When I did that, the president's body fell to his left into her lap. The right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed. There was a hole in the skull. I could see in that hole there was no brain matter left. It had all been blown out. I assumed he had passed. He was dead.
That car, the very one from the assassination, is now on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. It looks different today because it was heavily modified in the years that followed, including the addition of a permanent roof, and it remained in service for several more presidencies. But the images we've all seen of the car racing toward the hospital have Clint Hill hanging onto the back, doing everything he could to protect Jackie. Hill had been assigned to what the Secret Service called the halfback car. That was the vehicle that followed directly behind the president. And it was always just a few feet away, no matter how fast the motorcade was moving. That was a 1955 Cadillac Series 75, and it had 8 Secret Service agents, 4 inside the car and 4 standing on the running boards. Hill was positioned on the left front running board, which was the closest spot to Jackie, who was seated on the left side of the limo. So when the first shot rang out, he was in position, but he was still too far away to prevent what happened in just those few seconds. I also have a video on my channel where I go into a great deal of detail on the presidential limousine, and I will also put that link down in the description in case you're interested in that. Once they arrived at Parkland Hospital, their first priority was to get Governor Connally out of the limousine. He was also hurt, and he was really in the way of getting to the president. So the medical teams came in, they got him on a gurney, and then they tried to get Kennedy on a gurney, but Jackie wouldn't let go of him. And Clint Hill said that he repeatedly pleaded with her, "Please let go, let us take care of the president." But she wouldn't let go. She refused and continued to clutch onto her husband's body. It finally dawned on Hill that she wasn't holding on just out of grief. She didn't want anybody to see this horrible state that he was in. And realizing that, Hill removed his jacket and gently placed it over the president's head, and only then did Jackie let go, allowing the hospital staff to take him inside. Hill remained with Jackie in the hospital. At one point, he managed to reach the White House through a switchboard that they temporarily set up there in Dallas, and he reported the situation to his superiors in D.C. While he was on the line, the operator interrupted, and they said, "We have the Attorney General on the phone." And that, of course, was Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. Bobby asked Clint, "What's going on down there in Dallas?" And Hill explained that there had been a shooting, and Bobby asked, "How bad is it?" And not wanting to tell him outright that his brother was gone, Hill simply said, "It's as bad as it can get." And Bobby hung up the phone. The hospital then helped Clint Hill contact a mortuary to arrange for a bronze casket. That's the one that they used to carry Kennedy's body back on Air Force One to D.C. There's a lot of stories about a heated confrontation between the Secret Service and Dallas authorities about leaving the hospital with Kennedy's body. Apparently, Texas had a law requiring homicide victims' autopsies to be conducted before the body could be released. So there was supposedly this tense standoff where you had armed Secret Service agents allegedly pushing past local authorities to remove the casket. Clint Hill's recollection was much more of a civil exchange. According to him, the hospital's chief physician ultimately agreed to release the body under the condition that a physician would accompany him to the final destination for an autopsy. So, with that agreement, Kennedy's casket was loaded into a hearse, and Jackie Kennedy insisted on riding with him, and she was joined by Clint Hill and the White House physician as they made the drive to Love Field, where Air Force One awaited them. So they carried this 600-pound casket up the narrow stairs, Jackie following closely behind. Once inside, they had to maneuver this casket into place. And here you're going to see perhaps the only physical reminder of that day on this airplane. You see it's dressed with aluminum trim now, but they took a saw right here to this bulkhead and they cut along that line and they removed this section of the bulkhead to be able to pivot the casket through the door and into this section of the plane. And they removed these 2 rows of seats right here, and they placed the casket in this section, and they tied it down with cargo straps to keep it from shifting during flight. But yeah, this line right up here, that's where the cut was. And so at this point, Mrs. Kennedy retreated to her private room aboard the aircraft, and she had a brief conversation there with President and Mrs. Johnson, who offered their condolences. And meanwhile, Clint Hill went to the front of the aircraft, likely joining other members of the Secret Service. And this may have been his first real moment to start processing some of the enormity of what's going on. Later, Lady Bird Johnson recalled hearing one of the Secret Service agents on board say, "We've never lost a president in the service." At some point while he's in the front of the aircraft, Hill received word that Mrs. Kennedy wanted to see him. So he immediately went back to her, and when he arrived, she looks at him and says, "Oh, Mr. Hill, what is going to become of you now?" Hill later reflected on that moment, realizing that even in the midst of her unimaginable grief, she was thinking about him. She knew how much he and his fellow agents had cared for the president, and in that moment she was more concerned for them, perhaps, than herself. So shortly before the airplane departs for Washington, President Johnson is sworn in right here in the president's office, where Kennedy had been sitting just a few hours prior. They had 26 people crammed into this small space witnessing this history in the making. Clint Hill was not in that famous image, but he would have been nearby. After the oath was administered, President Johnson gave his first order as president, "Let's get this thing in the air." And Jackie retreated to the back of the plane. Hill would have followed her, and he stayed beside her and the casket for the entire flight back to D.C. Clint later recalled that the back of the plane was very quiet, not a lot was said, but from what we know now, Jackie was already planning. Even in her grief, she had begun mapping out the funeral, discussing who would carry the casket, where the president would be buried, even the idea of an eternal flame at Arlington. And for the rest of the flight, Clint Hill remained at her side, back there with the casket, just as he had all day, watching over her as she mourned. Once they landed back at Andrews Air Force Base at 6 p.m., the casket was removed from Air Force One. Clint Hill stayed with Jackie, now joined by Robert Kennedy, as they accompanied the president's body to Bethesda Naval Hospital for an autopsy. It was a really long night. Around 2:45, Clint Hill was called in to view the president's body. So he saw the wounds up close and watched as Kennedy was prepared for placement into a new casket. The original bronze casket would later be dropped into the ocean from a military aircraft to prevent it from becoming a morbid curiosity. Even after all those hours, Hill never left Jackie's side, and by the time they arrived at the White House close to 4:30 a.m., he was still with her as the casket was placed in the East Room, where the Kennedy family would have their private time with the president. Clint Hill never really recovered from this. It took decades for him to be able to talk about it. He blamed himself for not getting to the president in time. He stayed with the Secret Service for a while after. He continued to protect Jackie until sometime the following year, and then he worked under Presidents Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. But he struggled with severe PTSD, and that led to alcoholism. By 1975, he was just 43, and he had to retire. Later in life, he started to open up a little. He co-authored a few books about his time with the Kennedys, and in doing that, he was finally able to make some peace with what happened that day. I think when people look back, he's going to be the most remembered of all of the Secret Service agents that day, because when everything went wrong, he ran toward the danger. He was willing to put his life on the line for the First Lady, and no matter how much guilt he carried, the world still sees the man as a hero. I'll see you down the road.